Dear colleagues, it is a great honor for me to call this meeting to order and open the very last plenary meeting or session of our 17th International Conference. And doesn't mean that the conference is ending. There would still be scientific and research sessions. Tomorrow will be more, and some subsidiary conferences that will be taking place and events of this nature. But this type of a meeting, like the plenary meeting, is the very last one for this conference. And it is not fortuitous that it is dedicated to the issue of government administration. And this is something that has been discussed in the previous conferences. We decided to change the format this time. We decided to go away from the format someone would probably call a format of a forum. That's the way the April conferences started off this was initially suggested by Mr. Yasin, and he wanted to introduce this format in Russia, the format of discussions between the experts and politicians on the subject of relevance, and then more and more discussions of the papers started becoming more prevalent in our meetings. We have this experience that we could borrow from our experts in the natural sciences. That's the procedure we use when we discuss papers like this. So these two formats coexisted in different and varying proportions. So we had scientific discussions and the plenary meetings, discussions of this kind. So this year we made a step forward, as we believe it, and we conduct these plenary sessions based on the written papers with an emphasis not just on assessments, but rather on the arguments that are going to be made. And I understand and I realize not all of the participants could provide those papers in the form and way that it exists today. And the paper will be presented, followed by a discussion of a paper. The authors of this paper is the Rector of the Higher School of Economics, Mr. Yaroslav Kuzminov, and the Vice Rector, Andrei Zhulin. We will structure this discussion in the following way. I will give the floor to Andrei, and Yaroslav, if he wishes so, could add a couple of things to what Andrei will probably not mention, but it's likely that he's going to omit a few things. It's a 38-page long document. Following this, we will start asking questions about whether we properly understand the content of the paper, and after that, we will ask other colleagues to speak. They were kind enough to agree to make those speeches, and then we'll have a discussion and exchange of opinions, and hopefully we're going to be able to fit all of this within a span of time equal to 1 hour and 30 minutes. This is indeed the very last plenary session, and of course the government administration is not the least issue on everyone's agenda. This is something that has been mentioned at many of the sessions that have taken place here, because this is essentially everything boils down to, at least that's what we believe. And so in that sense, this plenary session is kind of summing things up. And so I give the floor over to my colleague here. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I will try to keep to the time limits. The paper has been distributed together with some of the books that are available on the government function. What prompted this presentation is this. Over the last half a year, there's been an ongoing discussion of the issue of the reform of the state apparatus, the administrative procedures, And this had to do partially with the President's guidance that he has given at the most recent meeting. And we decided to provide an overview of the history of the administrative reform. And we wanted to begin with the concept of the administrative reform that dates back 11 years. This is the very first document that stated the goals and objectives for the 5-year period back then, but it's still something that would use as the basis for any further actions. Out of the 6 indicators or parameters that were used at the time, only one of them has been completely fulfilled. It's the one colored in green. That's the level of satisfaction of the citizens with the quality and accessibility of government services. There are 2 parameters where we did not meet the objectives stated back in 2004, and these are the 2 indicators related to corruption. We even fell back from the goals of 2004. Then effectiveness of the state governance and the quality of state regulation is another parameter. And then the business's cost to overcome administrative barrier is something that doesn't have a proper metric to assess its effectiveness. And therefore it is difficult for us to make a proper assessment of how well we've done on this one. So this is an assessment of what has happened over the last 10 years. There's a decree of the President, date 601. It has to do with the key directions of the improvement of the system for government management and government administration. And I would like to say that the focus now has been shifted to the citizens. We are talking about a single point service window, and we have taken out here from this assessment issues related to business and costs to the business community. And again, this focus on the people has been retained, and the priority that has been assigned to the business is not even number 2 or even 3. I would like to point out that we are yet to create the statistics to measure the quality of the state apparatus, of the state governance. There are a lot of experts that could make their assessments, but we don't have objective metrics or measurement instrumentation that we could use to assess the administrative reform that started back in 2004, focused on a narrow sector of services, procedures, and such. And when we're talking about the reform of the administration, we would like to take a broader look at the overall state regulation building, if you will, and we will try to assess the policies pursued by the government by looking at them from the standpoint of the citizens. So we will be looking at the things like what are we doing, what we are trying to regulate, and how we work with the businesses and with the government officials. If we're talking about the stated goals, we believe that what is important here are 2 issues. It's the consistency of the goals of the states with the demands of the population and of the business community against the backdrop of the existing situation. And there was a law on strategic planning that hasn't yet, unfortunately, come into effect and given us any results. But over the last 3 years, the experts from the Higher School of Economics have been monitoring the risks associated with the implementation of the 2012 decrees of the President. And I would like to say that a lot of what is happening in this field right now is based on those May 2012 decrees. There are more than 200 guidances and more than 40 parameters that were to be correlated with the expectations of the people and of the people at the time. We studied in 2012, under the 2020 strategy, a lot of issues in terms of the expectations of the people regarding the social policies, and what was mentioned back then for the social policies, for the housing policy, for preschool education, and especially the budgetary sector and the salaries for the employees of the budgetary sector, that coincided with the expectations of the people. And this slide shows us a complicated but interesting picture. We're talking about two polls that date back to the April of 2014 and April 2016. This shows how people are assessing the importance of certain parameters, guidances, and events, and whether they see or do not see any results achieved. One can see that the upper row shows the important points that are important for the people, and what is highlighted in yellow is the liquidation of the lines and queues of people wanting to have their children rolled into kindergartens. And there was an issue with the salaries of the budget sector. And there are two important blocks here, one dealing with the results achieved and with the results not achieved. But those points that we're showing here are the priorities that were stated in the President's guidance, and they coincide with the expectations of the people. But that's not the problem. When the guidance is delegated to the lower level, there are issues that come in conflict with what's happening at that level. There are a lot of guidances, roadmaps, 5-year plans, but at the level of specific government body, they have to deal with all of those issues without prioritizing things, without identifying the things that are most important. And one has to control for whether a particular assignment has been fulfilled or not. And when this happens, people start to be overly formalistic when it comes to implementing the guidance and orders given to them. So, speaking about the stated goals, I would like to say that the goals were formulated properly, but the results of their implementation is something that deserve further attention. Then I would like to talk about some project activities that were implemented. The government, the cabinet, decided to measure the number of bills introduced to the State Duma, and if we look at this slide, we would see that one of the key agents that generates bills and laws is the government. 54% of those signed by the President were initiated by the President. We'll look at the statistics for the laws that we had in the database for bills introduced to the Duma, and I would like to say, so the chance of a law being signed into effect is about 92%. For the members of the parliament, the percentage that they target is 18%, so the government is very active here. One should note that the government of the Russian Federation, due to the fact that there are a lot of stages that a bill has to go through before it is submitted for the first hearing in the government, or rather the parliament, for acceptance, there are 22 stages involved in this, the preliminary hearings, and there are a lot of experts that look at those laws. And for example, the Ministry of Education is one of the experts that makes assessments. The Ministry for Communications is another ministry that assesses laws. There's a great number of experts that are involved in these discussions and the reviews of the bills proposed for the Parliament, and sometimes there is lack of coordination, and therefore sometimes chaos ensues when certain bills are being considered. So the longest number of steps before a bill becomes a law is 22 in Russia. We can compare that with other nations, and if we make the comparison, we will see that this is the longest of the chains that there is when a particular bill is being reviewed. Plus, there is a great deal of public reviews. We have an independent anti-corruption review board, and there are regulatory effect reviews that take place, and we believe that one of the key directions here is to work in parallel or concurrently, and that would allow us to reduce the number of those reviews. And we don't have to discuss this with everyone, but rather we could discuss this with the business community, with the experts, and this could be a very important reduction of these procedures. There is a separate procedure that we had a lot of hopes for. That's the procedure for the evaluation of the regulatory effect. This is one of the obligatory procedures under the current system. We looked at the statistics for over 160 draft laws for 2014 and 2015, published at the website, and 46% of the text of the proposed laws were not discussed at all. 31% received one or two proposals for change, and a really large-scale discussion took place for only 7% of all of the proposed laws. What is important to note in this procedure for evaluation is the quality of the comments that were made for a given draft law. In 4% of the cases, alternative methods are suggested for approaching a given problem for it to be solved. In 31% of the cases, the proposed laws result in the emergence of a new function for the government, and the new expenses of the budget are declared in only 3% of the draft laws. But we know that once a law has passed into effect, the ones responsible for the implementation of the law will come to the government and will ask for money, and there are new expenses that will arise for interest groups, and that's 17%. And this activity is something that contributes on a daily basis to the pressures applied to the interest groups. We are building up the state apparatus, the state's administration, and we are increasing the expenses on the functioning of the state apparatus. And if we compare our country with other nations, our partners or competitors, if you will, the effectiveness of the government-supplied laws is such that we can see a greater more deal of government-proposed laws are accepted percentage-wise. The other set of issues is the effectiveness of implementation of the government policies based on the guidance given by the president of the government. Well, there may be a lack of resources, low motivation, and these are the realities under which we have to exist and operate, and all of this forces us, the government authorities, to look for the strategy that would allow us to make sure that the guidances are implemented. We could see this with the example of the monitoring of implementation of the President's guidance. And we look at the process that begins with the guidance and all the way down to the specific plans that various departments develop in order to make sure that the guidance is implemented. And we could see there are several strategies to make sure that the guidances are formally implemented. Some of them have to do with the guidance that have specific measures, like cardinal measures in numbers that would allow the oversight authorities to measure whether the particular objectives have been reached. and reaching those may not require any significant actions. A good example is the creation of 25 million jobs. Back in 2013, we had a method that would allow us to operate with the notion of added value per one job, and if that number was exceeded by a certain parameter, that meant that was a high added value job. And then later on we started measuring the size of the salary of the workers, which basically deprived this whole idea of the main goal of improving the efficiency. The second example I would like to use, and we do this traditionally, it is a share of the people that have access to the government services via a single point of service, single window. And in April of 2014, it was 94%. But we are counting all of the multifunctional centers regardless of how many services they offer. And even if they offer just one service, then all of the people living in that particular municipality will be counted as having received such services via this single window. The other strategy we are looking at is a conscious introduction of draft laws with the need to have a lot of government authorities to vet them, and sometimes the work is protracted for months and years because of the many concurrences that need to be received. The same applies to the guidance on the development of professional standards, and out of the 300 proposed standards, only 10% have been registered with the Ministry of Justice, and this didn't require high-level approval because professional standards are the documents that need to be developed by the industrial associations rather than the government authorities. And the third trend we are observing is the shifting of the responsibility from the federal level to the regional level. And a good example of this is the so-called effective contracts that lead to the increase of salaries to the workers of the budgetary sector that were mentioned in the May decrees. This is an issue that deals with the increase of the salaries and improvement of the efficiency of those budgetary organizations. No methodological support has been provided, and this was shifted down to the lower level, and that basically resulted in us losing any practical sense in doing this. And the very last thing I wanted to mention about this part of my paper is the situation where the authority, the agency, is selecting the cheapest and easiest solution to a problem, which allows them to shift the responsibility to the Ministry of Finance, and this is something that would again take longer for the guidance to be implemented. The model of a new and independent assessment of the quality of the social services and the budgetary service is something that has put into the implementation strategy the conduct of a lot of expensive polls. So there are more direct ways to deal with this, like disclosing the information about the operations of such budgetary organization, but unfortunately they decided to go down this path. Another interesting point to make is that sometimes the federal elites are polled, and I'm talking about the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the largest companies, and they are asked to assess how very key objectives are achieved. The legislators believe that the good motivation is to increase responsibility for the implementation through monitoring. In the executive branch, there's only one way that they see towards improvement, that is by way of material monetary incentives. And this is indeed a situation where we do not have adequate resources to do this for the effectiveness of the government decisions. The next issue that we decided to highlight in this presentation is the feedback that the authorities received and how open and responsive they are. We have done a lot of work in this area, and over the last year we have been able to see that based on the polls conducted in the country, the level of confidence in the government has been reduced. And this has to do with the fact that we are now in the midst of an economic crisis, but partially it is also related to the fact that there are a lot of openness instruments that didn't really kick in. We have over 2,000 official websites that belong to the government authorities and municipal authorities and thousands of the budgetary institutions. But the traditional problem is that they are still like a business card for the organization, and the information that is posted on the websites in question does not allow anyone to assess properly the quality of their services or the quality of the social benefits that they provide. And we can see clearly from our monitoring results that people are trying to find information elsewhere if they fail to find it on the official websites, which results in unofficial private services emerging, which provide the sought-after information about the operation of government authorities. Here we're mentioning 74 websites, and none of them fulfills two laws on the processing of citizens' complaint, and there are several sections there that deal with the instructions on how people's complaints and claims need to be processed, but they haven't yet created a system for electronic interaction with people, which would be a fully fledged system. And when a complaint comes to a government authorities, those are printed out, and then after that, the entire document is being handled on paper. So the technologies remain the same old paper-based technologies. As for the information services, there are several of them, like the Federal Migration Service. They have, or rather, the Federal Tax Service. They have services that allow people to find out their tax identification number and their retirement-related information. I should say, in relation to this, that the various regions of Russia, when it comes to dealing with the complaints of the citizens, they made one step further, and they are one step ahead of the federal level. 23 regions have created portals that allow people to exercise control over government actions, and the Moscow practices are among the best practices. There is a site called gorod.mos.ru where people apply with their complaints, and there are millions of them. There are also similar approaches that are implemented in the Republic of Bashkortostan. I should also mention some of those structures that compete with the government, the private initiative of the government, of the people, and there are a lot of participants in these schemes, and they try to attract a great deal of attention from the mass media and from the society, and this is something that begins to work.
Another range of issues on supervision and oversight. We have had a lot of discussions at the venue of Open Government and Ministry of Economic Development. We know about the new law draft on supervision. We know that old law 294 is no longer relevant. Several types of supervision and oversight will be deleted. We see that this is a growing trend. Many types of oversight will be done away with. We are going to see a very negative statistics on the performance of oversight. We see that only 3% of organizations are covered, and only one would be actually tested once in 30 years. This distracts us from the real sources of threat. Therefore, we are going to use a new concept, a new approach. One point which we believe is important in the reform of government oversight, two things. When we talk about oversight, we are only going to use test procedures during operation. However, we are going to introduce several entrance-level tests. We believe that we want to have a better balance between entrance tests and tests in the course of operation. We believe that we should review the procedures to get a better balance. If the entrance barrier is high, then we have to do less in terms of oversight later down the road. We have to provide a balance which would support good level of security later. Now I'm going to come back to where I started. We don't have performance indicators. We can use different terms, costs associated with supervision and oversight, or whatever else. We need to have clear and statistically grounded indicators of burden that businesses have to carry. We don't have such indicators. Right now, we use what is suggested in the left-hand side. We have plans of inspections. We look at the share of inspections that ended in detection of violations. We do not have a full understanding of the damage done in the supervised area. We don't see the value of the violations that could be prevented. If there is life hazard, if there's damage to property, to the environment, to cultural heritage, all of that has to be stated in monetary terms. This would be a good incentive. We have to understand the costs that businesses have in the context of such inspection measures. A few words about human resources support. There's one point that we have reflected in our report. We think that the current situation is unacceptable. Inspectors have wages of less than 50,000 rubles, and they can make decisions on closure of business that have billions of rubles of turnover. I think we should have different categories. Administrative personnel that do not have responsibility for signing documents, and we can have kind of super inspectors like audit chamber experts who will have a higher level of salaries and who are not linked to specific geographies. This, however, would have to be further discussed. One last point that I want to make has to do with several World Bank indicators that have been observed over a period of 12 years. we don't see any significant change in either direction. And in 10 to 12 years, we have remained at the same level of public governance as where we have been before. Does anyone want to make any comments or add anything to the presentation? I'm going to pass the floor to Oleg Fomichev. We have an expert review here, and I guess it may be difficult for Oleg to speak on these matters. A gentleman has already voiced his personal opinion, and I can talk as a graduate of the Higher School of Economics. Thank you for the presentation. The issues that you have raised are quite reasonable. I agree with most things. We see most of the government service issues from the inside. I have a few questions regarding some examples that you have used, and I can comment on that in the fields of my responsibility in the government. The government governance system, which I see from the inside, can be divided into several pieces: government services, citizens, services provided to citizens, and all those elements are far from being perfectly efficient. There are several big root causes for that. Number one, we have not been able to limit the authority of local governments. Even if the situation gets out of hand, our government agencies will do everything. There's no such area that the government would not get involved in. There's nothing that the government would reject and say that it's not their business and let business community take care of it. We have no statistics for 2015 and 2016. We did collect some statistics for 2012-2014, which is a good reflection of the government work, because in most of those jobs we had experts in every field at the department level, and we have adjusted it all. The number of assignments has increased manifold. We have seen 2 times or even greater increase every year, and we all remember about the need to increase performance of government agencies, because we have seen headcount reductions for a number of years. So the first area of problems is mismatch between what government agencies are responsible for and what they really have to do. And the second problem is really profound. It's the procedures used by the government. They have seen very little change since the Soviet time. Everything works almost in exactly the same way. the technology has not changed, and we could definitely do quite a lot. We could use project management tools, we could use information technologies. However, if the core procedures remain the same, then you would just add new things on top of the old foundation. You can send all formats of documents electronically, but that does not change them much. This all translates into things that have been shown in the presentation. There is another problem that is obvious from presidential decrees if you have been following them, and I think you do in the Higher School of Economics. Presidential decrees are top priority documents for execution, and the number of control levels is really over the top. Out of curiosity, while I was taking classes in the Presidential Academy of National Economy, I tried to check how many people were responsible for oversight of every specific resolution. 5 to 7 levels of oversight at the level of ministries. People at the department level supervision, department level and this thing and the other at various organizations. Then there's an audit chamber and the prosecution office. There's a special office in presidential administration. There are other offices. There's other organizations, and I'm probably missing a couple of other levels. So that is an illustration of a situation with execution of presidential decrees. They spent 90% of their work time reporting to supervisors at different levels. I may disappoint you, but I have to say that ministries do not come up with assignments. It's not a way to avoid responsibility. We receive assignments from the government, and we have a list of bodies that are responsible for execution attached. So when you have several conductors, you cannot complete an assignment in 1 or 2 days. When there are 10 people involved, they also have to report to authorities at 9 different levels. So this oversight and supervision problem is very big. When we talk about public discussions and debates, we first have to look at the possibility of simplifying the system of supervision. The amount of time spent on this is really quite amazing. It's beyond any reason. There is another issue which has not been addressed in the presentation, although we all know about it. We have a huge number of tools and instruments. The government prescribes that we follow a large number of procedures. They are not always followed, and there is no punishment for not following them. There's always two options. If one doesn't want to, if there's a possibility not to fulfill them, then you don't fulfill them. However, this will mean that they could find faults with you if they wanted, and this makes the system less efficient. Against this backdrop, we have another big issue that is congestion in management communication lines. They are so congested that there's really a lot of noise there, and picking up what is essential is not an easy job. In this context, the Higher School of Economics is trying to do quite a bit with a highly open system. Any citizen can bring the attention of public authorities to any problem. We have a huge pipeline, and being able to trace an application is a big benefit. The system works well at the level of phone calls. This manual mode of operation turns out to work quite nicely. But how much you can do in a manual mode if you call up all different people, if you have to do everything yourself, following all procedures and this thing and the other. My colleague said that there's no problems at the level of target setting. I will disagree with that. I may not say very polite and politically correct things, but when we set tasks aimed at increase, improvement, enhancement, and all of that is associated with the government spending, but we do not make any decisions on rejecting anything. Then at the phase of execution, we may have serious problems. There's illustrations for that at different levels, and all people who oversee the execution of decrees know it very well. As of the 7% of things that get close attention and get reviewed, this may not be a bad number. That's pretty close to what we see in international peer bodies. This is just an illustration of the fact that we have not been able to set up a system of KPIs that would help us to review a large number of issues and create a short list of the most important, most painful issues. So we might want to use a smaller grid to really identify serious problems. So those 7% include the things that get a lot of attention and a lot of debates. Alternatives are offered only in 4% of the cases. This also comes from the situation that I described earlier, when you follow a resolution, which is most often the case. The resolution does not give you the outcome that you have to have. You are encouraged to develop a draft law that should do this and that. In this kind of setup, you would not be looking at alternative ways of reaching the objective. It all came from good intentions. At some point in time, around 06 or 07, the leadership decided that if there is a vague resolution, it gives people at agency level too much freedom to use their creativity, and they may not produce good results. Probably that could have been good to have more creativity in the approach to those resolutions. But now we don't have any. Every resolution prescribes specific steps of achieving the result. Another couple of comments. One on the grassroots level supervision and the regions doing more in that domain. Then again, we have to look at different regions specifically. Those regions that do it are usually better off than others. They have bigger budgets. When we had discussions and debates on the petitions issue, we wanted to give people an opportunity to send petitions regarding all kinds of problems which they see in everyday life. And then we immediately saw a problem. If you create this kind of channel and you have no financial possibility to respond to all the problems, then you are creating a serious headache for yourself, and this eventually can create an explosive situation. If you only have 10% of the funds that you really need to fix roads and motorways, and you get hundreds of thousands of complaints about the condition of roads, this will not bring any positive results. So only those authorities that are pretty well off, the agencies that have reasons to believe that they can satisfy the petitioners and fix the problems they write about. We will disseminate positive experience. We may do that in specific domains where local authorities will be ready to satisfy at least 50% of people's requests or more. And final remarks, the idea of super controllers may be worth looking into. We want to give a raise to the supervisors and inspectors. We don't really know how we can go about the decision making on closing companies with 50 billion of turnover. This is a big question, and we probably should give it more thought. There are different ways of understanding many sets of data. Like this one chart on the assessment of likelihood of different programs implementation. In yellow and in red boxes, we have the situation not because executive power is not willing to increase the level of discipline. We have such a high level of execution discipline that every person taking care of business is covered by 10 supervisors. What else you can do to improve performance? The same is true for another area on more frequent, more detailed reporting. If you talk to people who carry out resolutions and decrees, they can tell you a lot of interesting things about the level of detail and this may not all be common public knowledge, but public supervision and oversight is again giving us a similar situation. Over 4 years, well, let's say 3 years since we opened up everything, has given us a lot of disappointment from this public oversight, the way it works today. Maybe it seems to many people that we should focus more on this, but if we do, we definitely should do it in some other way. The way it happens now is not satisfactory. As of the two last measures, any government worker will tell you that we all would welcome salary raises. Thank you, Oleg Vladislavovich. We appreciate your expert opinion. Your opinion is based on a large volume of experience. I forgot to mention something else. The one-stop shop service organizations. There's been a few things that need to be fixed. Any such center, according to this document, is offering 94% of all government services. There are a list of services that every such one-stop shop public government services center should provide. There may be some exceptions when a new office is open and is just starting work, but we keep a very close eye on the range of services which they provide, and we have a very good idea of the range of services which they provide through this one-stop shop arrangement. And the alternative methods of providing public services electronically is an entirely different animal. The core of both formats would be the same. However, those government service offices seem to be more comfortable, and they also can accept a lot of documents in paper form. In government service offices, they can use a lot of paper documents, which is not an option in purely electronic digital channels. Electronic services look like they are cheaper. However, we have seen the real performance of different channels. We see that the costs associated with the IT systems for the back offices are very high. We have had a discussion recently of the measures to encourage electronic workflow between different organizations. It doesn't matter what happens in the front office. You can come there and get service, or you can get your documents electronically. What matters is that everything inside the system works electronically.
And that is why I believe that as far as this portion of the paper is concerned, there were a number of inaccuracies there, but in general I am in agreement with the paper's conclusions. We're not going to give the authors of the paper an opportunity to respond to the criticism, but I would like to emphasize that all of the papers made and delivered at the plenary sessions, including at this very conference, have been published as demonstration versions or something for trial, for review, and then later on the authors could formulate certain things better. I think that the author should be thankful to Oleg for some of the comments he has made, maybe even the ones that they don't agree with. But another thing I wanted to add is that Oleg was offended by the fact, but I'm not offended. I was just explaining what was behind those answers, and I know that myself. And I kind of guess that the authors know that too. Please note what we are talking about here. And where I'm driving at with this is where we need to understand clearly what we're trying to achieve here. This is a picture that reflects the weakness of the lines of communications that exist even within those groups. And I'm not talking about broader groups of population. And these are the line of communications between groups that are somehow associated with the formulation of the policies. They look at things from high points, but they see different things. And now I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Zhulin, and I would like to, or rather, Sava Shipov, and what we said last was a reference to the real burden and what a real government service work looks like. And one of the key problems that is quite clear now, but something nobody has tackled yet, in all seriousness, is trying to calculate the labor cost associated with the performance of specific government functions. It is clear there are some preliminary approaches to how to classify those functions. There is an understanding that there are government services, there is government administration, public control, but the experience shows that the real functionality of the government agencies is not something that anyone has ever calculated. But how can we optimize things if we don't know what is the correlation between the scale of the task and the available resources? This is indeed an issue. And I can say, using the example of the Federal Accreditation Service, that over the last 2 years, the burden from the standpoint of government services has increased threefold. And yet the staff numbers are not going up, they are going down. So based on this, we are forced to look for new opportunities for optimization. And the key to do this would be through informatization. But this is something that is quite costly. And there are reviews that are done by the Ministry of Communications. And all of those projects that are associated with informatization, they have to go through this service. But there is no singular system where those informatization approaches could compete with one another, so that we could see clearly which of the systems is a system that has a competitive edge. It all is a matter of different opportunities that may exist for resolving a particular problem. I must say that a key role, or an important role here, is played here by the so-called electronic reporting. Using our example, we can see a real result. There is a register of all certificates of conformity that are issued for various products. So this is something that hadn't existed in the past. Now we have it. But what does it all give us? Now every product, every good that moves across the border this good is checked against the paperwork that exists electronically, and one at the customs border point can check whether the certificate offered is indeed true and not forged. And that allowed us to cut off those documents that there was no other way to verify. And so we had the opportunity to reduce the cost associated with verifying all of this. Now, let's talk about this declaration of conformity. This is it's an essentially easy form of declaring the conformity. In the past, you had to go to the authority for certification. Now, the Ministry for Economic Development has issued an order that allows you to receive this free of charge without any intermediaries. And this is indeed something that simplifies matters for the business community, so that the bona fide business representatives could confirm the conformity of their products to the existing requirements. We are maintaining such a register. Another example I would like to use, in 2014, there were 7,000 declarations registered, and in 2015 there were 20 declarations registered, but based on the total number of the declarations registered, this is very insignificant. The number is very low, and we certainly tried to deal with this, but the business community is not aware of this, despite our awareness campaign, and this is a problem with the lines of communication, a problem with some singular policy that would ensure that the businesses are aware with how the government operates. And a couple of words I wanted to add about accreditation as an institute of government or public administration. Why is it important against the backdrop of this meeting's agenda? Accreditation is something that allows the government to delegate government authorities to non-government organizations. For example, we delegate the authority to verify the safety of certain products to certification bodies, and that's a lot of responsibility. However, we are aware of how this is done in the foreign nations that allow the government to alleviate the burden that rests on them by delegating this to non-government organizations. Let's just use one example. Experts may be accredited or attested and certified for various purposes. And who is handling such certification or attestation? Who's giving the examinations to all of these people? And the question is whether they are qualified and competent enough to carry out such tests. But abroad, they have certification authorities for certification of personnel. And they, once they get the accreditation, they confirm that they have the ability to perform this function. Why can't we introduce such a practice here? This is something that could indeed help us with the alleviation of the burden that the government has to carry. And this is something that could be used universally and could be propagated to other activities. Well, we all know that there are international standards that impose certain obligations on different organizations and companies, and they do not necessarily apply just to goods and products and services, but to the overall operation of the organizations. This is another area where we could do away with using government inspectors, and there you don't have to deal with the government oversight for a foreseeable and long future. And this is something that could be looked into, and it could potentially help us optimize our operations. Very briefly, I wanted to speak about a number of things that I believe are important from the standpoint of regulation. Let's look at those large, important laws about the reform. There's always, following that, a plan to enact a number of bylaws following that law. Has anyone looked at how much on schedule we are with enacting those bylaws? And what happens? Does it correlate with the enactment of the law itself? If we look at this, we will see that there are bylaws that haven't been enacted for decades, and in a perfect world, you wouldn't have been even allowed to operate without them. But what we have instead is a gray zone where the operation is still ongoing, which means an ineffective public administration. The law 59, law number 8 are not being implemented, but we need to realize that everything has its own cost and it has its own value. And the number of appeals and complaints coming from the citizens is something that exceeds the rest of the work that the federal branch of executive power is supposed to deal with. But if we want to give our citizens certain guarantees, we need to understand that the government is supposed to pay for this. But we know that if a government official doesn't respond within a prescribed amount of time, that means that that person is liable to an administrative penalty. But how can we assign such responsibility upon those government officials without giving them the tools to implement that function? This tool is quite often used for unfair competition, especially as far as complaints on Law 294 are concerned. We need to properly identify those citizens and organizations that can appeal. If we want to see some legal consequences, then those individuals have to be properly identified. It doesn't have to be a lot of a burden on the citizens and the organizations. It could be an electronic digital signature. It has to be something that identifies the individual properly. And very briefly, I want to talk about some of those measurements, numerical measurements that were mentioned. These measurements and these indicators varied, but there was one that was never mentioned. That's the indicator of a success of a bona fide business, conscientious business. We want to make sure that the bona fide businesses can operate successfully, and unfortunately this is something that the controllers and the inspectors have not been looking into with a great degree of detail. When Sava was talking, I was being reminded of the imbalance that exists between those functions that are imposed on the government organizations and its departments and the abilities and capabilities that the government organizations have. When Yaroslav initiated the administrative regulation approach, and they have been introduced, and their implementation is something people have to be held responsible for, but it's a fairly common sense matter. I mean, you need to check what you can do, and if you can do something, you will just abandon this as an idea. But what really happened, and probably those of you present here would remember, the Ministry of Finance wanted to have some room for maneuver, and they blocked this law. And now we are where we are, and I'm not complaining. What I'm trying to say is that a decision that was supported a long time ago, it was basically approved, but it was never brought to fruition. But this is a response to the question asked here. And I realize that there may not be another possible answer to this question, but nobody wants to assume financial responsibility, and nobody wants to abandon some things that people are used to. If you calculate certain things, you will then realize that what you want to introduce, you will never be able to actually see that happen. So that is something that needs to be dealt with. And now I'm happy to turn the microphone over to Mr. Dmitriev. He is an independent expert right now, but he's got a great deal of experience working for the government. Probably he's got most of the experience of those present here. And I don't know if all of you are aware of this, but those changes that are happening in the public administration sphere and in the government service area that have been implemented, some of them fully, some of them just a quarter, some of them by half. He's been involved in all of them. So you have the floor, Mikhail. Thank you very much. But I would like to say right away what is going to be the nature of my presentation, what you will see in this presentation. The logo of the Russian Academy for National Economy and Public Service. And there are things that are not my initiative, and this one of them is a project that has been implemented by the RANC, and they asked me to assume the responsibility for coordinating and setting the goals for this project. This is much more narrower than what has been done at the High School of Economics, especially in respect to what was mentioned in the paper. We were monitoring what the High School of Economics has been doing. We are really in awe of what has been done. This is a very important initial primary material for what we are doing. And what I would like to say is not going to be, or it shouldn't be construed as a criticism or as a critique. We are really thankful to you for what you have done. And I believe we are working in the same direction. We are aligned as far as our goals are concerned and the results we seek are concerned. But I would like to mention briefly the following. This has to do with the fact that when we started our work, as far as the oversight authorities are concerned, we wanted to conduct the first pilots of what we were involved in, which was the optimization of routine processes, part of the optimization of the overall public administration sphere. When we were studying those reforms in the naught years, nobody understood how this should be done and what this will lead to. But now we have this understanding, and this is all resting on the best business practices, including local practices and those that exist elsewhere in the world. There's a lot of experience available there. We were talking about how to improve productivity, how to increase salaries for government officers. But if we do not properly identify those routine processes that could be measured using certain algorithms and then optimized and automated, then we would obtain a result that would be far from what we are seeking to achieve. And an example of optimizing a routine process in the oversight sphere, we mentioned customs here. I'm talking here about the issuance of a veterinary certificate. And in one of the CIS countries, this is a very routine process that is repeated time after another. And this is an event that is not dependent upon the activities of this particular body. Somebody applies for a permission to do certain things. After that, the process is very strictly determined, and at each stage, the number of decisions that could be taken is very much limited. In the case with the veterinary certificate, the officer cannot make a particular decision that would not be based on a veterinary's certificate or a report regarding, let's say, certain vaccines that need to be imported into the country. That means there is a limited number of options, and this allows one to build a very deterministic algorithm with a set result, and the end result would be either to issue or not to issue a certificate, and that would also serve the purpose of minimizing risks to the health of the livestock that needs to be vaccinated. Plus, it serves the purpose of speeding up the issuance of certificates. And in this particular example, the initial issuance of the certificates took so long that the vaccines would just spoil before they could be imported into the country, which resulted in epidemics. And this optimization has allowed us to achieve the following goal. In the left-hand side, we see the algorithm the way it was described in the non-structured functional state, where things were not put in good order. There were a lot of excessive vertical processes that are based on the existing and current assignments. And then in the right upper corner, we see the algorithm that is the result of the optimization and simplification of the process. When we did away with excessive functions, roles, and context with the subjects of control, this allowed us to reduce all of the elements of control and reduce the time it took us. And following that, we were able to automate the process. We simplified many things, but that was not all. A number of some elements at the inputs was reduced by a factor of 7. The number of steps within the process was something that was reduced by a factor of 15. The number of business roles was reduced by 4 or 5 times. What this has resulted in, we were able to reduce the time it takes to issue a certificate. We've improved the quality of our work, and it took just 4 to 6 days for an applicant to receive the certificate, even after the lab certificates were issued. The productivity was improved, and everything was done in a much better way, without corruption, and a much better results were produced. And this allowed us to increase the salaries by 1.5 times to 2 times, and productivity grew by a factor of 3. And this is not something that could ideally be automated, because in the area of control and oversight, this was not something that was done frequently. And when Mr. Sava was talking about the need to focus on the assessment of how many people perform a particular function, if we are trying to optimize those functions, we would not be able to do this, because a function is essentially a classification according to types of activities that allows us to identify the specialization of a body of power and how the functions between are distributed. You cannot describe the functionality with the result, but if we introduce a rule of procedure, then you would see there between 5 to 15 different processes that are part of the order of procedure, and then you would transform what comes into the system all the way until it comes out of the system. So we identify this system and we turn it into a working algorithm. Once this happens, we are focusing on the target result. We are controlling the resources that allow us to achieve the result, and then we can manage the effectiveness. We can achieve productivity improvements and effectiveness improvements. These are results that are amazing, something that we couldn't have hoped for, and these results are not achievable. So it seems to me that we can go step by step. We could identify a particular procedure. We can break it up into the routine processes, use certain algorithms, and then you optimize the process from the standpoint of algorithms. Then once you've identified the things to optimize, but if we do all of this, this means that we can transform the overall control and oversight function in a magical way. However, this brings me to another part of my presentation, which is the result of our reflections on the materials that you have presented. The results of these reflections state what happens if we start introducing optimization pilots and automation of those routine processes. This provides us with at least one parallel process for which we've recently introduced a roadmap on the improvement of activities of oversight and regulatory authorities. Now a decree is being prepared to move over to the more discrete way of conducting oversight. What is happening when we're trying to superimpose process optimization on the process of moving over to more improved system of risk-oriented oversight and control systems? Here we are starting with something that allows us to bring up a lot of questions that we do not have answers to yet, and they are very serious. And if we fail to answer those questions, then we will be creating risks for a new wave of imitation of the process, because everyone was complaining about today during this session. I will only focus on 2 of the problems that are related to the transition to the risk-oriented surveillance. The first one of them is what is related to some of the things that were mentioned in the previous HSC papers. Most of the supervisory authorities already have risk-oriented approaches, but only in the statistical format. That means that all of those that are being monitored and supervised, they get into a risk category automatically, regardless of whether they have indeed created problematic situations. They would still be in the risk zone. If we take the dynamic option, it is clear that might be a better, a more optimal way to handle the situation. This allows us to continuously evaluate the quality of each object or subject of supervision, and this subject then moves into different categories of risk depending on his or her input. This allows us to optimize the expenses, cost of the business, and abandon excessive control, instead focusing on those areas where the real damage is done. But let's look at this from another angle. In order to move to the dynamic way of managing the risks, one has to do the following. We need to implement a large number of administrative things. We need to move to this dynamic system, and in order to do this we need to create automated systems for managing data that would be based on current monitoring of all of those subjects of control and oversight. If we're talking about sanitary supervision or similar departments, we can be talking about thousands of subjects. If we create databases, we need to have methods of using them, and then we will be accumulating more objective information about the risks that are generated by every subject of supervision. And this is a multifaceted project that we cannot really hope that it would be implemented in any foreseeable future, but there are positive examples of this, but they started much earlier, and they have been working on the implementation for 10 years, and even then and there they still have certain issues that they run into. But if we are trying and get to the bottom of this optimization, then we would be doing this on the basis of the existing setting system in public administration. It means that the configuration of these processes is quite specific, and it would be reflecting some outdated methods of performing public administration, and it would not reflect that level of automation that would be possible after the automated management for data systems is created. And this would also go hand in hand with the dynamic way of assessing the risks. It would mean that we would be doing the same thing twice. We would optimize the initial process first, and then 3 or 4 years later we will be re-optimizing the new process. But should we really do it this way? Whether it's the optimal approach to the overall reform of the supervision and oversight industry. Now we are approaching the pilot stage in at least 3 oversight and control agencies, but because of this issue of moving to the risk-oriented supervision, the question that arises is how to combine all of this. The second problem that is correlated with this, and I will briefly mention it, reflects the results of the paper presented by HSE. We agree with it. We believe it's a good and deep result. This is an issue of a very heterogeneous legislation in the area of supervision, and this may concern some of the areas, so let's say sanitary oversight, but even in the area of technical regulation or fire regulation, construction regulation, the situation may be quite different. There may exist a great number of poorly structured, contradictory norms and rules that these supervision authorities have to go by. In addition to this, there are obsolete and outdated regulations, but nobody has taken care of revoking them, and their number is great. Sometimes it's in the thousands. And the routine process of implementing an oversight function with this level of uncertainty in law enforcement, it's not something that can be subjecting itself to proper optimization, and it cannot contribute to the improvement of productivity. But we are talking about the optimization of regulations, and let's take the example of the Ministry for Construction. Their program is for at least 2025, or until 2025. And until this approach is used, and the process-based approach to optimization, all of these activities will be stalled. And this takes us back to what we are doing now in the interim. What are the opportunities there that exist for identifying the process that could be optimized, and how can we take our first steps towards dynamic control? And
how we can have big wins and how we can perform transition processes, not to have a slack in productivity. And the last thing, how do we identify the areas for oversight and control that need at least sorting out and novelty base to start with them. And there are areas where the legal framework will not allow us to automate the process. In fact, these are the key questions. Up until we did our bit and until we saw your part of the project, we were not fully aware of the difficulties and the objectives. Now we see how we can join our efforts for going forward as part of the roadmap adopted by the government. It was extremely interesting to listen to everybody, and I did not limit any speakers, and we went very much beyond, already beyond the time limit, but it would be wrong to not to give the floor to those who kept silent so far and give them the chance to very briefly outline what they have to say. Very brief comments, please. And everybody is impressed. No, you're welcome. Svetlana Petrakova, if I could put my question to the State Secretary. For the past 2 decades, what are the major outcomes of the administrative reform? 5, if you can list 5. After all the comments and questions, we'll be able to respond. No further questions. It is clear to everybody that these are challenging issues, but it appears that there are some solutions in sight. Okay, before answering the question, before answering a few points. Number one, on Michael's presentation, we were texting each other with colleagues the picture with optimization diagrams. There's one deficiency with civil servants who read at several iterations of embarking on administrative reform. Back in 2010, we, instructed by the staff of the Council of Ministers, Sergei Sobyanin was the head, we were creating a system to optimize control and oversight functions as part of 12 or 15 decisions to be implemented. There were quite a few of them. There was as it is process, as is ought to be. And we were drawing diagrams. And then the customer, the government disappeared when Sergei Sobyanin became mayor. It was impossible to optimize the operation of the ministries. And so we suffered for a year and then they closed the project because there was no demand. Now, since we are on a different stage, so bad luck helped. Since funding has gone down and oversight bodies are seriously interested in streamlining and optimizing managerial processes, and now that the risk-oriented approach is the order of the day, and the task was simpler, at that time, we were to remove absurdities, obvious absurdities and redundancies. Now, it's a deeper task, not just to remove what is redundant and necessary and to rather make it operate effectively. So we are going back, but on a new foundation. And another topic, civil service. Civil service reform in that sense is different from other reforms in that we tried to implement together with the Ministry of Labor best practice in organizing civil service procedures, hiring, career ladder. In the decrees, then it is those who were to implement it, they were writing draft decrees, and they would not sabotage presidential decrees. The Ministry of Labor was willing to do it. Then this was part of the decrees. Then with these instructions were implemented. If you superimpose new approaches on life as it is, then there is a conflict. You cannot introduce incentives or increase pay only through bonuses and extra pay. And having worked very hard and suffered together with the Ministry of Labor, if you look at civil service, we need to go to a lower level and identify key problems that are the roots of everything else. So the basic processes are the way they are, and then that is reflected on oversight, supervision, function, public services, and so on and so forth. Now, answer your question. I wonder if I can come up with 5 accomplishments. 294 law 294, when it was quite functional and workable, and it allowed to reduce administrative pressure on business. And then there's always a pendulum in regulation. Then first we make cuts, and now the pendulum is back, and we need to level out. The second accomplishment, what we call interdepartmental, interdep. When during 1 year, through titanic effort together all levels of authority, we moved all the documents, certificates that people use, people request for, we helped automate it. This multifunctional, multi-service center is a successful project. It presents a new face for public services. The difference between what is now and 5 years ago is huge and obvious. And this public services centers is not only this ministry's successful project, but success for the entire cabinet. Another interdepartmental project, inter-ministry project, is for oversight. We remove. The bill is with the Duma. No. It's already adopted. And now there will be bylaws and decisions of the government as per the law. The documents that the businesses will not have to submit during inspections. There are many good things and right things that have been done. It's hard to recall. Yeah. Here we have the accomplishment, the regulatory impact assessment. Justly or justly, it is being criticized, but regulatory impact assessment is a breakthrough decision and solution for the past 5 years in public administration. There are many issues, but that would be more in number if without it. Thank you. Thank you. Brief response to the comments and objections. Andrei? With regard to the civil service section, we shall expand in the final version of the report. Yeah, we try to experiment with abolishing organization charts and so on and so forth. I would like to respond to Michael's presentation. There's pictures with EPC. They go back to 2005 when 679 decision on administrative regulations was drafted. There was an attempt made to translate business process languages into administrative regulations. And it was an attempt to write the word function in Russian, and we see the outcome. E-administration regulations, modeling not only just business processes, but the operation of all authorities, government authorities. The issue is different. The issue, there is no motivation. Any business owner will invite advisors, consultants, will look at the business processes and enhance profits. With oversight, we don't know how to motivate administrators, middle level, how to motivate them. Yeah, we can't go through the entire process, but a business process is not just a process. It concerns interests at the lower level, middle level, conflict of difference of interest, struggle and competition for resources. We have no entity to order and book oversight reform. We don't know how to measure the outcome. A very serious thing about the dynamic system, but I think it's the day before yesterday. Oh, sorry, the day after tomorrow. The oversight agencies, the way you describe it, it's business intelligence. We don't have the register of supervised entities. And IT function is zero there. I mean, I think it was IS slot system, and it's little used. It's all paper-based. There are leaders, of course. Roskomnadzor 5 years ago had a system in place for submitting documents electronically, but that's a leader. Initially, we need to understand who are the objects of oversight, of the supervision, and then the essence of the violation or infringement. With regard to legal regulation in various areas, nobody understands it. We have thousands, 10,000s of acts. Thousands of acts published before 1991, which are still effective. Supervisors don't know the entire array of requirements based on which they make inspections. So much is printed in books. It's not in the internet even. And so our wish to publish all the requirements and the ban on in instructions of oversight agencies based on requirements that are not published. If something is not on the website, the court should not adjudicate, should not consider that, should not examine. I mean, the oversight bodies will be surprised how diverse and illogical this the regulation system is. Let us come to a close. I don't want us to end on a sad note. Issues are complex. When public administration is discussed, we know it is complexity. Other issues, when are discussed, easy ways are important. I just discussed moderated healthcare, and the solution is easy. Give us money and we'll resolve all the issues. When businesses discuss issues, they know the officials are corrupt. Let's replace civil servants. I can't but share with you. Recently, I've seen a call for class peace. It was the week of Russian business, 7 days. Dr. Markov was saying, he said that class peace is achievable, but central bank should print money sufficiently for everybody. But when public administration issues are discussed in a professional milieu, then it turns out it's not as simple. I've long understood, I can quote my favorite poet. Who was he fighting with? Himself. That's the way our state is functioning. I will not be deliberating on why is that. There are no simple solutions and simple fixes. It's good that you have asked this question, what has been done, what has been achieved? But surprisingly, something is achieved and accomplished. It's not 1 decade that I'm involved with it, despite many things. Teachers and doctors, they know, despite what the Minister of Finance is doing. And here, despite we are the way they are. The project, the paper, the report, Michael's team, yes,